As folks are joining us, just to be cognizant of everybody's time, we're going to go ahead and get started with today's program. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar intended to endure the history of the Supreme Court robes. I'm Jennifer Hurst-Wender, Preservation Virginia's Director of Museum Operations and Education, and I thank you for joining us today. This webinar is part of a series of educational programming organized by Preservation Virginia. So I encourage you to visit our website and explore the many opportunities to connect and learn about John Marshall and his home, as well as our other historic properties and programs. Today, as we dive into the history of the iconic robe and how it came to be, I'd like to acknowledge our panelists, Lea Lane, Preservation Virginia's Curator of Collections, and Matthew Hofstedt, Associate Curator for the Supreme Court, for whom you're all here to see today. To start, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So by this time, I'm sure that you are all extremely familiar with Zoom. And so no worries if you're not, though. But you'll notice at the bottom, or maybe somewhere on your screen, you're going to find a chat box. And just so that we're all comfortable using the chat box, we'd appreciate it if you could write in there and let us know where you're tuning into from today. So it's a really neat thing that in this digital age, we can have participants that can join us from all over the world. And we really appreciate knowing the distance that these programs travel. We'd also like to know how many people are viewing the program with you. Is it just you? Are you with your friends, your colleagues, your family? We'd really like to know. So this webinar is going to last an hour, and we want to be very respectful of your time. And so at the end of the program, we have reserved a question and answer period. And so at any point during the program, you are encouraged to type your questions into the Q&A block. So whenever a question pops into your mind, feel free to ask. Our panelists will respond to as many questions as the time will allow at the end of the program. We're also going to employ the chat box to share some links with more information to how you can visit the John Marshall House to see the robe in person, or if you wanted to take a visit to the Supreme Court to see some of the exhibits that are up there. This session's being recorded and it'll be available in the next few days, and we encourage you to share it with your friends. All right, so since 1911, Preservation Virginia has maintained and interpreted the John Marshall House to share the great Chief Justice's life and legacy. No other site holds more personal items associated with John Marshall, nor reflects his personal sensibilities better than the home that he had built in 1790, and that he lived at with his family and the people he enslaved until his death in 1835. The objects bring the rooms alive, and it doesn't take much to imagine the activities of family, the enslaved household, and the many guests who visited John Marshall's home. And while his books, furnishings, paintings, tableware, and personal items provide a detailed picture of who he was, there's no artifact that defined Marshall's judicial career better than the robe that he wore during his 34-year tenure as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And the robe was cared for by generations of descendants before finding its way into our collection. Marshall wore this robe as he presided over 34 years of Supreme Court cases, during which time the Supreme Court was elevated to a co-equal branch of the federal government. And today, the simple black robe is a recognizable icon of the American judicial system. Iconic symbols are often born from stories that represent who we are as a nation. There are American objects like the Liberty Bell and the Star-Spangled Banner that are part of creating this American mythos. And the robe is one such witness object. It holds stories from the days it was worn, hearing arguments before the court, cases like Marbury v. Madison, which is perhaps Marshall's most significant precedent, judicial review, asserting the court's power and authority to interpret the U.S. Constitution. It also holds stories of our nation's injustice, as it is a witness to precedents set in cases decided that perpetuated and upheld the institution of slavery. This object also carries stories of more mundane activities, like hanging on a peg in the old Supreme Court chamber inside the U.S. Capitol, next to the robes of the other justices, to the care that it received over the years of curation by both family members and Preservation Virginia staff. While the stories of John Marshall being the first to implement the uniform that defines the American judge today may have been exaggerated, there is no doubt that this robe as a witness object, having been worn during some of the most formative moments in American history, is a national treasure. Now, we were able to successfully conserve this iconic piece of our national history because of people like you. Your contributions have helped ensure that the robe has been stabilized and environmental factors are controlled to slow further deterioration. So thank you. Now our work continues. As we move to the next phase of providing ongoing educational programming like this presentation, both digitally and in person at the house, visit our website and sign up for e-news so that you can learn more. Okay, so now it's my honor to introduce you to Preservation Virginia's Curator of Collections, Lea Lane. Lea graduated with a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Virginia. She earned her master's degree from Winterthur in American Material Culture. Lea joined Preservation Virginia at the very end of 2019 from the Cincinnati Art Museum. And since that time, Lea has curated Preservation Virginia's historic sites through some of the most unusual times this organization has gone through, with both grace, skill, and also a fair amount of humor. It's been a pleasure working with her on the conservation and exhibit to house John Marshall's newly conserved robe. So Lea, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jen. It has been such a delight working with you for over a year now, and what a year it was. We are so excited to be here today to discuss this robe because it is really the culmination of a lot of hard work, especially by folks like Jen, who has been working on this the entire time that she's been at Preservation Virginia, basically. So hats off. It's good stuff. All right, I'm going to share my screen, which might take just a moment. So do hang in there with me for a second, and we will get this rolling. All right. So as Jen mentioned, we have cared for John Marshall's black silk judicial robe for about 108 years now. It was one of the first objects to enter our collection, and it's always been one of our greatest treasures. So before I pass things on to Matthew to go into a deeper story of judicial textiles, I'd like to introduce you to this newly conserved object, which is currently the centerpiece of an exhibit at the John Marshall House. John Marshall may have had more than one robe over the course of his 34 years on the court, but this is the only one that survived. There's nothing that points to a particular date in terms of construction or materials, and the only unusual aspect of the design are the sleeves. The folds in the gimp are on the reverse rather than on the front, which you would expect to see on contemporary robes. Whether or not this was a mistake by the original maker, it's clear that it didn't bother Marshall, as the robe shows signs of use and no attempt to amend the design. Perhaps it was personal preference. As for those signs of use, wear on the hem, sweat, and pomade residue around the collar, which you can see a little bit of in this image, they underscore the fact that, as Jen said, this is a witness object. It was present in those historic and those everyday moments. Marshall inaugurated 5 different presidents on 9 occasions, and the press often noted his black robe. He donned them for portraits, like this one, which happens to be my favorite, which is by Chester Harding, taken in 1829. And of course, there were the cases. This robe was witness to critical rulings like Marbury v. Madison, but also great injustices, like Marshall's repeated denial of African-American freedom suits. So we don't know exactly where the robe went after Marshall's death in 1835, but it likely passed to his daughter, Mary Marshall Harvey, who inherited most of his Richmond property. Although she owned the John Marshall House, which is marked in green here on this map, she and her household actually lived a couple of blocks away in the house marked in red. So the next time we have a confirmed sighting, of the robe is in 1888. Yeah, proud of the robe. Pardon me, something's blooming today. So the next time we see it is in 1888. And it's with Annie Fisher Harvey, one of Mary's daughters, who loaned the robe to the, to the Virginia Agricultural, Mechanical, and Tobacco Exposition, which had a relics and antiquities section. A lot of these early expositions did. Oh my goodness. Now, by 1892, Annie and her sister Emily lived at the John Marshall House. Now, for years previously, the house had been rented out to other families. And so by this point, 1892, they're back in the family home. And they had a nephew named Dr. Hatley Norton Mason, who recalled that the robe was tucked away in a pasteboard box within a cabinet in the parlor. Now, we now interpret this space as the small or family dining room. And the cabinet he's talking about, I think, is the one you can see in the back of this circa 1890s image. This is during the Harvey sisters' residency. So just beyond those little two doors in the back corner, the robe's probably in there. So um, now we don't have a photo of Dr. Mason actually wearing the robe in 1892, which would be very cool if we did, but we don't. But we do have this one from 1962 of Dr. Mason in the robe. And this was after an enormous conservation effort that took place in that year, over 600 hours of work. We did not try on the robe this time. So things have changed a little bit. Now, the Marshall House, as Jen mentioned, was transferred to the stewardship of the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, now known as Preservation Virginia, in 1911. And in 1913, the house was opened to the public. On that opening weekend, the star attraction was that robe, on loan from the Harvey sisters. When Emily died in 1920, the robe became part of our permanent collection. The robe has been exhibited in various spots around the Marshall House, generally shown on a mannequin, and it has traveled for exhibitions, including to the Smithsonian in 1967. The many years of display, exposure to light, and stress on the fibers caused by hanging it have all compounded the fragility of this remarkable object. The silk robe itself is sometimes its worst enemy. It has what we call inherent vice. These are attributes that are inherent to that material that make it more sensitive to damage, and it makes it happen faster. Heavy metals and iron were involved in the processing of the silk cocoons into the woven black fabric, and this undermines the strength of the structure of that weave. It also increases the rate at which it deteriorates. Silk is also especially sensitive, just in general as a fiber, to changes in temperature and humidity, as well as exposure to UV rays. Between its inherent vices and its many years of display, the robe needed an intervention. Since 2005, more than 15 years, it has been off view, only pulled out for special occasions and for visitors. Here's Jennifer with what might be another familiar face to you, Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor, when she came to the house to pay a visit. In 2019, Preservation Virginia, in partnership with the John Marshall Center for Constitutional History and Civics, launched the Save the Robe campaign, which was to help support this conservation effort. And thanks to the donors to that project, many of whose names are listed on this slide, we were able to place the robe in the very capable hands of Howard Sutcliffe of River Region Costume and Textile Conservation. Howard has worked on priceless artifacts from across the world, from Chinese court robes to our own favorite Kermit the Frog. If you want to get the full story of the conservation of this robe, which is fascinating, I encourage you to check out our YouTube page for a webinar that we recorded with him a couple of weeks ago. Now, I will not go into too deep of detail here, but here's the basics of what he did. Howard spent over 300 hours on this conservation project. He carefully studied the condition of the robe, especially with regard to the many campaigns of previous restoration work. In the top left there, you can actually see some of the different types of patches that were there when he got the robe into his studio. Now, sometimes these well-intentioned interventions were no longer in line with what we consider to be best practices in conservation, or they just weren't serving the same structural support role that they were intended to do. In some cases, he removed those repairs completely, and in their place, he carefully added lines of special stitches that linked an unstable textile with a new lining. He carried out an extensive surface cleaning, which I learned through this process, that conservators actually keep what they vacuum off. They use a very, very sensitive low power vacuum. And so when he brought the robe back, he also brought me a vacuum bag full of dirt from John Marshall's robe. So if anyone has any ideas of what to do with dirt from John Marshall's robe, I am all ears. It does have a really important purpose, especially in archaeological context, but now in our collection. And so without further ado, I do want to show you a before and after shot. So with Howard's assistance, we worked with Proto Productions, which were based in Chicago, And we designed a case that would be a responsible way to display and to store this fragile textile. Now, the massive span of this robe is matched by the enormous scale of this case, which you can kind of get a sense of here. It measures 6 by 7 feet. It has UV protected glass, a sealed object chamber that will help keep the temperature and humidity stable, and it's lit with motion activated LED lighting. The goal was to create an environment that was as stable and as dark as we could possibly make it, one that we would rarely need to remove it from, as that mechanical wear from moving it is how most of the damage is actually going to happen to this artifact at this point. Howard also developed these special pads that help support the robe as it rests at a slight angle in its new case, so no more hanging off of mannequins. So I invite you to come and see the robe, its snazzy new case, and the accompanying exhibit at the John Marshall House. The exhibit explores the history of judicial attire, but only at a pretty surface level. So for the whole story, I am delighted to pass things on to Jen, who will introduce curator and scholar Matthew Hofstedt. Let me unshare my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Leah. That was excellent and great pictures too, right? So now it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Hofstedt. So Matthew is a 1989 graduate of the University of Notre Dame and served as a United States naval officer before embarking on a museum career. He has a master's degree in museum studies from the George Washington University, and his first museum job was as a museum technician at the National Museum of American History. In 1996, he joined the Office of the Curator at the Supreme Court of the United States and has been the Associate Curator since 2002. When he's not working with the court's historic collection or developing new exhibitions, he researches the institutional history of the court and topics like the judicial robes. So this is right up his alley, and we are so thrilled to have him present today. So with that, Matthew, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen now. Get that up here. Before we get started, I just want to say my thank yous to a couple of people. First to Jen and Leah for inviting me to do this webinar. I've sort of had this as a pet project, sort of trying to figure out what happened with the early robes and when the switch to the black robe actually happened for probably 20 years. And I also want to thank Preservation Virginia and all the donors for finally getting this project to completion. I have emails from 2005 from your predecessors talking about this project. And so congratulations to you all to finally getting it done and making it happen. It looks great. And I look forward to coming down to Richmond someday soon and taking a look at it. A couple other thanks just to my colleagues in the curator's office who listened to me talk about robes for all these years. Apologize for that, but here we are. And also to Claire Cushman of the Supreme Court Historical Society. I showed a draft of this article to her several years ago, and she has patiently encouraged me to complete it for many years. And I appreciate her patience and encouragement to, even though I don't know a lot of answers, that we can go ahead and have this article that's going to be published in the next Journal of the Historical Society, and then this webinar. So this kind of getting the story back out and seeing if we can learn more about these early robes. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about John Marshall. This is John Marshall statue in the exhibit hall of the Supreme Court building. If you haven't visited, the great Chief Justices he's often referred to cast a long shadow, not only in legal history, obviously, but also in the institutional history of the court. And as we've alluded to earlier, well, there's a lot of traditions and things that the court does that are usually attributed to John Marshall. And I think in the 19th century, often these were said, oh, we don't really know, but that dates back to John Marshall's time. And what happened over time, people started to put agency to these stories and attributing them that Marshall did them on purpose and had a reason for doing them. And the most obvious one is the switch to the black robes. The story has been told in many recent biographies of Marshall and in court histories that he purposefully chose the black robe to go against the colorful robes the judges were wearing prior to this, and that was an attempt to show Republican simplicity and take leadership with the court. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that story is just not true. And now I have some proof to finally share that, and hopefully you'll agree with my conclusions about all that. So one story is why does Marshall get that credit? And it's basically based on one quote. It's a quote from Senator Mason of Virginia in January of 1802. And he says, "Stayed upon his knees before 6 venerable judges, the Supreme Court, decorated in party-colored robes as our formerly were, or arrayed in more solemn black, such as they have lately assumed." So people have looked at that quote and said, well, lately assumed must be since John Marshall got there. And that's where I think this story kind of moved into this other realm of giving Marshall agency in this story, rather than, we don't really know who did this. And so this is the quote that most people source as why Marshall gets credit for this. Now, what we have to remember is when John Marshall came to Washington in 1800, actually, he was Secretary of State under John Adams. He was doing that job, and this is the Capitol building in early 1801. And the court met here in a borrowed conference room. Nobody knew where the court was going to meet when it showed up in February of 1801. Marshall gets appointed Chief Justice in January 20th, and he sits with the court on February 4th. So that's like 2 weeks. And I can't imagine that in those 2 weeks, with all the other things he's doing, he managed to go get a robe fitted out and told all the other justices that they need to wear black now. So the story just doesn't really hold up when you start giving it some scrutiny. And just adding another image of the robe on loan to the court back in the 1970s. So what really did happen? So let's jump back a little bit, and I'm going to talk about this portrait of Chief Justice John Jay by Gilbert Stuart. This portrait was painted, started in 1793, and Jay sat for the head only. He had to go off to England to negotiate what became the Jay Treaty. And there are letters in the family that suggest that his nephew actually posed in his, quote, Chief Justice's robes for the painting to be completed. And it was delivered to Mrs. Jay in 1794, and she immediately hung it up on the wall in their house. And so this was a family portrait that no one, I don't think, really saw very much. And it wasn't until 1815 that I found the first engraving of this portrait that was sort of widely produced. So the colorful robe of Jay was not really seen that much in these early periods, but people knew it was his Chief Justice's robes internally, and anyone that knew about it. John Adams, when he saw the engraving, wrote back to the publisher that there's my friend John Jay wearing his Chief Justice's robes. So myths start developing around the Jay robe over time, because it's the only one that anybody knew about. And the painting is very prominent when it appears in the Supreme Court in 1877. This is a copy of that portrait that the court still owns, and it's above the mantle in the justice's robing room. And so people would come in and ask about the robe, like, you're wearing black robes, what's Jay wearing? And this engraving by Currier and Ives actually is part of this possible mythology building. This is Chancellor Livingston of New York, the highest judicial officer in New York, swearing in George Washington, 1789. Well, there's no proof that he ever wore a robe at this event. And even though it looks just like John Jay's robe, and there's a story that was told for years that Jay borrowed this robe from Livingston to be painted by Stuart, that just doesn't hold any water when you start realizing the fact that the robe is actually still with us. So here's the John Jay robe. This is in the collection of the Smithsonian at the National Museum of American History. And it looks very much like what we saw in Gilbert Stuart's portrait. There's some slight differences. The sleeve lengths are a little different. You see there's an inner sleeve here, and there's this outer piece that's on the outside, but the red is faded. The white trim is there. So it's very similar to what we saw in that portrait. This robe is actually sent to the court in the 1880s, so the justices can see it for themselves, and they think it's his robe. But stories continue to sort of be told about where this robe came from. Is it an academic robe? And there's a story that it's a robe from the University of Edinburgh, which gave Jay an honorary degree in 1792. But as we'll see, the justices were already wearing the robes in 1792, so it couldn't have come from Scotland. And then there's stories that it came from the University of Dublin. And then there's a story that it's a Harvard robe. The Harvard robe story is the one that's most talked about in books more recently published. And unfortunately, there's no evidence that Harvard gave out robes at the time. They did award Jay a degree in 1790, but there's no note that they gave him any type of robe, and he did not attend the ceremony. So the idea that this academic robe is from some university just doesn't hold water either. So eventually the robe comes back to Washington. The court can't take it in the 1920s, so it goes to the Smithsonian, and that's where it is today. And that's actually a great thing because they've taken very good care of it. Like the John Marshall robe, it's really been well cared for. It went through several conservation efforts, and it's still in fairly good shape. We're going to see some robes that unfortunately didn't get the same treatment. So where does this robe come from? Like, why does it look the way it does? Well, here's just a couple of English judges that would have been around the same time that the American colonies were going to move into independence. This is William Blackstone, the famous judge and lawyer. He's wearing a Doctor of Civil Laws robe, which is very similar in style to the J robe. And this is the more traditional English judge's robe with that white ermine fur edgings on the scarlet robe. So this is what people would have known were sort of legal attire of the mid 18th century. So when the colonies also have courts, obviously, so you have colonial robes that were also colorful. So here's Judge Edward Trowbridge, a Massachusetts judge, and there's evidence that the Massachusetts courts wore red robes like this. And then this is one of the greatest portraits I've ever seen of a judge. It's Chief Justice Martin Howard of the Colonial Supreme Court of North Carolina. It's actually in a museum in Spain, and it's online. If you want to look at it, definitely do. The fabric literally three-dimensionally comes out of the painting. It's a fabulous painting. But all of these show that there was a general acceptance of robes and things prior to the American Revolution. So what happens when the new Supreme Court that is being created comes and sits for the first time in New York City? This is the building where they met. This is the Merchants Exchange building, which was at the foot of Broadway in downtown New York City. The court met on the second floor. Over here, it's an open air market underneath, but we understand they closed the market, we think, while the court was sitting, hopefully. And there's very little documentation about what happened on this day. There's no description of what the judges wore. They just kind of did some business. There weren't any cases to hear because they were the first time they sat. And there is documentation that when this sessions ended, that they had made no decision about what judges would wear. And in fact, there's a letter to James Iredell, who's an associate justice who is still in North Carolina. His brother-in-law writes him a letter and says, the judges didn't make a decision. You should wear your bar gown when you go out on circuit. A bar gown was kind of a black, simpler robe that lawyers would use in arguing in English courts. So we think pretty sure that they didn't wear any robes at the first sitting of the court. And in fact, I'll show you in a second, there's one commentator who noted that prior to the wearing of robes, they wore simple black coats, which he preferred. So we leave the New York and we head towards Philadelphia. And this is a receipt that was sent to John Jay, and it actually details a robe transaction. So several of the justices write letters and they mention wanting to pay for robes. We don't have anything that talks about why they're deciding to wear robes, but we do know that they're starting to get these robes and pay for them. This one is about James Wilson, one of the associate justices, borrowing money from Jay to pay George Douglas $53 and change for a robe and making agreeable the account. Now, George Douglas, I'm not exactly sure who he is. There's no one in the city directories of Philadelphia with that name, but there is a father and son in New York City who are merchant tailors. And they were right around the corner, basically, from the Merchants Exchange building where the court was meeting and where Jay lived in New York. So my suspicion is that this is the key player on where the early robes came from. I think George Douglas is connected with the Douglas Trading Company that had branches in Scotland. And my suspicion is that these early robes may have been ordered from overseas and sent to the court, because it takes almost 2 years for them to finally arrive. And now that's still a little bit, we're not sure. There's a lot of questions about this that we still don't know, but that gives us some clues as to the justices are starting to get robes. And then there's this really interesting letter that comes from Thomas Johnson to James Wilson. Thomas Johnson joins the court in 1791 after John Rutledge resigns. And he writes to Wilson, well, would you oblige me by having a dress made for me that is agreeable, intended for the other judges? So this indicates the other judges have already ordered their robes. Johnson needs to get one so he can match what everybody else has on. What I found really interesting about this letter is that at the end he says, I should have rather inclined against it, the wearing of robes, but I am not too perverse as to be singular in things in themselves indifferent. So he would have probably voted against wearing robes. So there's a little bit dissent even in the early justices about whether they want to wear these colorful robes. But this definitely shows that Johnson wanted a robe, and Wilson actually writes back to him in a couple months later and says, your robe has been made. So we know it was made. So what happens? February 1792, the court comes to meet in this building. This is the City Hall in Philadelphia, now called the Old City Hall, right by Independence Hall. And there's a courtroom inside that's interpreted by the National Park Service as the courtroom of the Supreme Court. And this is where the justices first wore a unique set of judicial designed robes, not academic robes, not anything else. And here's a picture of it. No, this is actually a drawing that an artist made in the 1940s, we think, trying to show what the early court might have looked like. It's the only one I've ever really found. It's not great, but here it is. But we do know that there's newspaper articles, and one of the correspondents says that he is very highly pleased with the appearance of the judges of the Supreme Court in their robes of justice, the elegance, gravity, and neatness of which were the subject of remark and approbation with every spectator. So the justices are wearing robes. We don't know what they were thinking, but we think it's about connecting to that legal tradition of wearing robes by judges from English courts, that they wanted to have dignity and decorum to their sessions, and that's the reason why they chose to wear the robes. Now, almost immediately, people don't like the robes. There's obviously the nascent federalist, anti-federalist sort of world starting to develop early in the United States in the 1790s. And here in a newspaper article written by a pseudonym of Russell, I wasn't able to determine who Russell was, but he actually addresses this on the dresses of the judges. And there's a long diatribe about how they shouldn't wear any of this stuff, and it should be simple Republican virtues and no robes at all. And he actually mentions that he went to the court and he found them to be in scarlet trimmed with ermine. This is probably mistaking the white trim on the robe of Jay and the other justices for the fur of the ermine, or it's an intentional slight trying to connect to those English judges. And he's the one that notes that earlier he saw the black coats that until lately were observed on those seats. So that's the one person that I was able to find that confirms that before these robes come out, they were not wearing robes. So you got these two sides of the argument. They're kind of trying to figure out, what the judges are, why they're wearing these robes, but they are. And they continue to do so probably through the 1793, 1794. And in 1795, there's a letter from John Rutledge again. He was the associate justice that resigned. He comes back as chief justice under a temporary commission. And he writes to James Iredell again, who he knew from the Southern Circuit. And he writes, he's just gotten into town in Philadelphia and he's going to sit with the court during the August term of 1795. And he writes, I would be obliged that after the court rises that you would give me a sight of your gown. Or if Mr. Jay's or Mr. Blair's robe is here, basically, can I get it so I can wear it tomorrow when I show up for court? So he's trying to find a robe to wear to match everybody else's. This letter is important to me because it shows that he thinks Jay, who was Chief Justice, and Blair, who's Associate Justice, are wearing the same robe and they're all interchangeable. So that's sort of another clue that all the robes look the same. Jay's robe is actually back in New York at this point because we know he's using it to paint that portrait up in New York. So it stays with the Jay family. So that wasn't there. So possibly Blair, who had just resigned a few months before, his robe may have been available. We just don't know. So that gets us to 1795. So we've got this period where they're wearing the colorful robes. And then comes this portrait. This is a portrait of William Patterson. He's wearing the same judicial robe, and we think this portrait dates to sometime 1797. It's hard to date. The Sharples, the artist, came to America in late 1795, so that's as early as it could have been painted, and he painted through almost 1800, so it could be somewhere in that time period. Sharples, unlike Gilbert Stuart, painted very small portraits. So this is only about 6 by 8 inches. It's very small. And it was done in 2 hours, and he would hand it to the person who was getting the portrait done right after he was done. So the fact that Patterson's wearing this robe, to me, is indicative that he was wearing it when he literally was sitting there having this portrait done. And he wouldn't have known about Jay's portrait, which is hanging in the Jay family house back in New York. So he had to be in this robe. So this gives us a sense that the robes may have been worn into the 1790s, later 1790s. Again, there's not a lot of documentation for this. And here are the two robes side by side. These are the only two from life portraits that we've been able to locate showing these robes. Jay's here. If you were to turn Jay into profile, I think the robe would line up very similarly to this. It looks very wide here and on the robe, but you can't tell that on this angle. So I think it's basically they're all wearing the same robes. So what happened to all the other robes? So if we know they all got robes, what happened to them? So here's what I've been able to determine so far. We know Jay's robe exists. We know that John Rutledge probably didn't have a robe because he left when they were first ordering them, and then he comes back as Chief Justice and he's looking for one. And then James Wilson and William Cushing, there's nothing about their robes that anyone's been able to locate, or at least I've been able to locate. So if anyone out there in the world knows anything about their robes, please contact me. And then John Blair, we know he paid for a robe. So the assumption is that he had a robe. And Thomas Johnson, we know a robe was made for him. William Patterson is the one with the robe is in the portrait. So these two robes could be the same robe. It's possible that, you know, Johnson retires or resigns right away and he just passed, we use this robe. Patterson is brand new, it never got used. So we don't know, that's possible. For those of you who are students of the early court, you'll notice that I left somebody out, and that is James Iredell. And this is the key piece that changes the narrative of this whole story. Iredell was on the court from 1790 to 1799. He died in October of 1799. And thanks to Ross Davies, who was as a professor at George Mason University, he gave me a tip that there was a mention of an Iredell robe being on exhibit. And I found this old catalog from the North Carolina Historical Exhibit at the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition. And this is from 1907. The exhibits actually go back into the 1890s, I think. And somewhere in this exhibit was James Iredell's robe. I've not been able to spot it in here. His portrait's up here on the wall. I think that's him right there. But the robe isn't visible. And the catalog actually says that even at this point, this robe had suffered from the terrible times from the time. So it's in bad shape. So just to shock, not to shock anybody, but unfortunately, this is the state of the Iredell robe. This robe is now in the collection of the North Carolina Museum of History, and I thank them very much for letting me come down a few years ago and taking it out of storage. I don't think it had been out of its box in years because of its condition, and they laid it out so we could kind of take a look at it and see what's going on. What you'll notice right away is it's all black. There's no red and white pieces, and that shocked me right at the time when I first saw this, and that led me down to do what we're doing today. What you'll notice is the main body of the robe is completely gone. One of the, I forget, it's the weft and the weave or whatever the textile terms are, is completely gone. But you see that the sleeves, the inner sleeves of the robe, like Jay had, are pretty intact. The top part up here we'll take a look at is fairly intact. And these are actually the outer sleeves. You remember on the Jay robe, they're red and white pieces on the sleeves. These actually are what I'm calling outer sleeves that this would be attached to this inner sleeve. And as you can tell, they have a weird sheen to them. It's very hard to tell. And I'm trying to work with the two museums, the Smithsonian and the North Carolina Museum, to get these two robes side by side so that they can really be looked at. But what you notice right away is that there are very similar attributes. This is the outer sleeve of the Jay robe on the right and the Iredell robe on the left. They have the same treatment of the buttons. but this is up on the top of the arm of the sleeve, not on the back of the sleeve like John Marshall's. It's kind of similar to the same treatment there. This seems to be more decorative, doesn't have a function that I could tell. There's some slight differences. The cordage looks a little different. These still retain their red color. This robe, the J robes, have been massively conserved, so I'm not sure what's real and what's conservation pieces that were added. But until they can be really looked at by a textile historian and taken apart, we won't know for sure. But there are enough similarities to think that they are very closely related in design, if not made at the same time, at least were made one after the other in a short amount of time. The selvages on the silk pieces are matching as far as I can tell. And I noticed, I think in the John Marshall pictures, that they have gold selvages too. So another thing to sort of tie all these things together. I'm guessing there was a very high quality of silk that only came from 1 or 2 looms, and that's what they were using for these robes. And what I found interesting here is that there's this piece of fabric still in the top of the back of the robe that has that reddish, peachy red, white color of the faded color of the J robe. And this, I think, is a remnant of the stole that was removed from the Iredell robe. So I think the Iredell robe was altered to become a black robe at some point between 1795 and 1799. Until further study is done, we won't know for sure, but that seems to be what happened. So what were the other changes that happened at this time? In 1796, we get 2 new justices come to the court, Oliver Ellsworth, Chief Justice, and Samuel Chase. They're both known to have worn black robes after 1800. There are no life portraits of them showing them in robes prior to 1800. This one is later engraving of Ellsworth. They could have been the reason why there's just a practical reality of, we've got 2 new justices showing up. We don't have these colorful robes. We ordered them from England, so it's going to take a year. Let's change to a black robe. That's one scenario that could be the reason why they did this. It also could be the building animosity of the anti-federalists complaining about the court wearing the robes. They decided, hey, let's tone it back a little bit and go to a black robe that's a little more acceptable. No, we don't know. We're still trying to figure that question out. But just yesterday, literally, after the tweet went out about the conference, this webinar, Professor Gerald Magliola, I hope I said your name, Maglioka, of Indiana University, sent me an email and said, did you know about this letter about Justice Bushrod Washington's robe? It's always confused me because he ordered a black satin robe. And this letter dated from April 1799. So Washington joined the court in November of 1798 under a recess commission. And so he must have known at that time, or soon thereafter, that he needed a black robe, which pushes the date of the switch prior to probably April 1799. The letter's from a friend of his who's helping him get the robe, and she says she will have it ready for him when he arrives in August of 1799. So this is new. It's not in the article that's published. I didn't know about it till yesterday. So I'm hoping more things like this will be generated from this talk and from the article being published. So what do we know? New timeline. No robes were worn from 1790 to 91. Colorful robes, 92 to 95. Not sure what happens from 96 to 98. And then from 1799 and on, all black robes were worn. So unfortunately, John Marshall can't be given credit for this anymore. Also, one kind of just interesting topic that I've not been able to really run down is, it doesn't appear they ever wore these robes when they were out riding circuit. There's a couple of anecdotal things that may indicate they did, but so far they haven't really held up to any scrutiny. And I just recently found a letter referencing Joseph Story returning costumes to the Federal Circuit Court in 1824. So that may be when this happened. So another area to do some research. So what's next? I want to try to just whip through this last so if we can get some questions in. Of course, is there another pre-1799 robe out there somewhere? That would be amazing to find. We do have one document that references that Patterson's robe may have survived. I have not been able to locate it in any place that it might sort of logically be. You know, are there more archival records out there like Professor Maglioka sent me? Like, hopefully there are, and that would help fill in these gaps. And of course, I think there's a question of like, what do we know about the John Marshall robe really? Like, how old is it? Is it from 1801? Is it from some other period of time? And I've got two suggestions on that. There are 2 other robes that I know about that are closely related. This is the robe of Chief Justice Roger Brooke Tawney. It is at the the Frederick County Historical Society in Frederick, Maryland. It is in remarkable shape. It is still almost supple. So that makes me think it's probably from the 1850s, maybe more than the 1830s. He's from 1836, he became Chief Justice. But looking at the design of this robe might lead some clues as to where Marshall's robe was made. And there seems to be the thing, if you were a Chief Justice, your robe got taken care of, but if you were an Associate Justice, it might not have been, because unfortunately, this is another robe that I found. This is the robe of Associate Justice Philip Pendleton Barber. And it is in terrible shape, as you can see from this one picture. I thank the museum. I don't want to, they got out the box with this in it, and they were afraid to even, touch it because it would just literally fall apart. This robe's construction, if it could be taken out and looked at, might be very close to Marshall's robe because he joined the court in 1836. So just an idea that maybe there's some research potential if you want to research the Marshall robe more to try to figure it out. And so finally we get to 1840s, we get photography, the court robes become sort of known to everybody, and you can actually document the robes a little bit better. We actually acquired a robe that we thought was Joseph Story's robe about 10 years ago from a descendant of the store of his. And when we got it and we really looked at all these images, we found out that it probably wasn't, and it was an academic robe that he wore probably when he was teaching at Harvard. He was a law professor at Harvard. So unfortunately, but at least now we can kind of know more what these robes look like and track how they change over time. And of course, that leads to the sort of iconic group court photograph of justices in their robes. You'll note a lot of these are open in the front, which I think is an interesting thing to sort of look at in terms of style with the Marshall robe, which, how he wore it and how that plays out. And of course, that brings us to the present day court. This is our most recent group court photograph, just taken a few weeks ago. And even within this, they all wear black robes, but there's slight differences among the different justices, even here with the plain black robe. You may recall Chief Justice Rehnquist put gold stripes on his sleeves for a period of time. There's no rules that say the justices have to wear robes, but that changed back in 1799, probably now, 1798, led to this becoming the iconic way that we all look at our judges. And it has spread throughout most of the courts in the United States and in some places around the world. So witness objects is totally a great way to think of the robe. The portrait of Chester Harding is amazing. It is a document of what we think the courtroom looked like in 1830. He was working on this massive group court portrait. It never happened, but we actually have another one of those witness objects. This chair is in the court's collection, and that chair is right here in the portrait, we think. So we've got one to go with your witness objects, but these are important ways. There's not a lot of things that the federal judges make. They make paper. They make laws, and they don't make laws, they interpret and make decisions. So these objects are few and far between. And so I really appreciate that Preservation Virginia has taken the time to really save this really remarkable judicial artifact. So in the end, John Marshall, he's our great Chief Justice. He'll always be the great Chief Justice, whether he's in a robe or he's not in a robe. These are two images of Marshall from the Supreme Court building that I thought would be fun. So thanks for listening. You can reach the curator's office and me through a portal on our website. I just put a picture of that. There's a link here. If anybody has questions or knows of any of these robes that might want to share them, I'd really appreciate it. It's a really pleasure to be here today. I hope you enjoyed listening, and maybe we have time for a couple questions. So there you go. Oh, I have to stop my screen, right? There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. We learned so much just now.
I hope I didn't go too fast.
No, it was wonderful. But also, I'd like to say that your research was invaluable as we put together this exhibit. So I don't think that I mentioned that earlier, but if it wasn't for you, then I don't think that our current exhibit would be half of what it could have been. So thank you for that. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions, and I'm going to kind of just start from the beginning. And so we did have a question about, for Lea, to give a little bit more history about the robe at the exhibition. Where was it displayed? Why was it displayed there? Any information that you have on that?
Yeah, and I didn't want to go too deep into it because I was learning from Matthew at the same time. So the exhibit took place in Richmond proper. I don't know where in Richmond. And there was sort of a main central structure. So I imagine that it was probably sort of a subsection of that. But the objects that were assembled for this were actually pretty amazing. They were quite representative of sort of the classic roster of founding fathers. You know, Patrick Henry's letter, or so-and-so's snuff box. And so it was really very much a relic focus, which I find really fascinating, especially in a post-Civil War context where relics became really mainstream and the idea of collecting these things became very important. And you start seeing at the same time these massive World's Fairs and expositions just happening across the globe. So there's an interest in collecting and categorizing and figuring out what's important, what do we need to save? And so I think it's telling that from that early date, at least the Harvey sisters, who self-submitted it, like you could basically be like, here, I think this is something worthy of displaying, and they probably would put it on display. So I imagine they had the impetus to do that. So yeah, it's not a great answer for your question, but I definitely advise going down that rabbit hole.
Thanks. All right, so another question. There was a letter, Matthew, that you put up that stated that the robe was going to cost $53. Any idea how much money that would have been today, or what the equivalent would have been at the time?
I have not had a chance to sort of figure that out. It seems to me to be a lot of money for one robe. Then at the end of the letter, it says, and to settle this account. So it could have been other things that Jay was charging with the merchant. The merchant who wrote the receipt was named James or John Shields, and he is a merchant in Philadelphia at the time. But I've not taken the time to try to figure out how much that was. I think the justices were making not that much money in those days. Their salaries were $500 or $1,000, I believe. And so I think that's a pretty substantial sum. So it seemed very odd to me.
Am I right in thinking that the justices paid for and continue to pay for their own robes, or is that?
Yes, the justices supply their own robes. And I've heard a story, and I didn't include it in anything because I have not been able to document it, is that they actually requested from the government to have the robes paid for, and the government denied that request. I've read that in one place. It's one of those very sketchy stories, and I'm hoping to one day track it down, but I wasn't able to before all of this happened.
So there were a couple of points made about the wigs and how the English court they kept the robe, but they didn't keep the wigs.
Right.
Do you have anything to talk about that?
I just know that there's one story. I've been trying to focus on robes, but the William Cushing story is the one that is usually told. Cushing was the Massachusetts judge, and he wore a wig, and he continued to wear other wigs. Wigs were going out of style in the early 1790s when the court was sitting anyway. And there's a story that he wore the wig the first day the court was coming together in New York City, and he was walking down the street, and a crowd started following him and laughing at him, and he didn't understand why this was happening. And then all of a sudden somebody said, well, it's your wig, of course. And he was so embarrassed he took it off. And then that's where I could trace back to the 1830s. So that has some validity that it could have been told the generation before, and someone who actually knew William Cushing. But I think the wigs were so horrible, and everybody agreed. And the quote about Jefferson and the rats peering out of the oakum is so on point. But the problem is I can't find anything that substantiates it earlier than 1896 when the guy wrote this article. His name was Lucius Proctor, and he manufactured this amazing story between Jefferson and Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Of course, they're in Hamilton, so of course that's who you would use. But even then he says they're sending letters back and forth, and they're having this dialogue, and and there's just no evidence of any of it. So I think it's made up.
Going along those lines, there's also a question about, do you think that the movement to the black robe had to do with party transitions
Party transitions and
from from a federal court
right.
to Jefferson?
Well, right. So at this point, I don't think that's the case. If we move this date forward to the 1798 or 1799, there's a lot of growing tension, but the Federalists are still mostly in charge. Oliver Ellsworth comes in as Chief Justice. He's a Federalist. He's, one of the senators that, was drafting the Judiciary Acts and stuff like that. Chase is a staunch Federalist. And gets in trouble for being so pro-Federalist from the bench that they try to impeach him later. So I think the change it may have something to do with that, but my gut's instinct is that it's a practical decision based on where are we going to get these robes from, and doing something that's more simply available and can be made quickly. And I think you even noted in Howard's lecture, which I listened to, that the John Marshall robe is even kind of like sloppily put together, like the construction isn't really very good, which implies it was probably made in the United States and not by a professional, robe maker in England. So there's probably some level of, hey, we should probably think about getting rid of these colorful robes. And some of the justices didn't like it, as the letter of Thomas Johnson indicated. So as the membership changed, I think there was let's get rid of the robes. And I think James Wilson, it has something to do with all of it. And when he dies in 1798, I'm guessing there's not enough votes in the conference, as we call it today, to keep wearing the robes, so they switch.
All right. So one last question. Where do the modern justices get their robes from?
Where do the modern justices get their robes from? There's a couple of actually companies that sell judges' robes to everybody, so they can get them from them. And then there are some people that actually get them from overseas. There's some nice robe making still done in England and France. I don't know what the current justices are wearing, but I know that some of the prior justices had robes. Justice Ginsburg, I believe, had a robe from France. So, they can get them from a variety of sources. It's not that hard to find a judicial robe these days.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. In case you need one, right?
Right. Well, that's about at the end of our time. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. This was an absolute pleasure. And for all of you who haven't had the opportunity to go up to DC, I don't know, are you guys soon? Probably you'll be letting people back into to visit.
No word yet.
No word yet. Okay.
One day soon.
All right. But yeah, I mean, any details that you wanted to talk about the article, where people can find it?
The article is in the next issue of the Journal of Supreme Court History, which is put out by the Supreme Court Historical Society. I believe it's published online already, and the paper copies are being printed and will be sent out soon. The Historical Society has a separate website. They're a separate than the court itself. So you can check out their website too to look into it. So.
And that's the U.S. Supreme Court Historical Society?
Yeah, Supreme Court Historical Society is their official name, United States Supreme Court Historical Society.
Okay. It's an amazing article, so I hope everybody gets a chance to check it out. And so, Lea, Matthew, thank you so much once again for joining us. To all of you watching, this presentation will be online probably within about a week. And thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. Have a great day. Bye.
Take care, y'all.